Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique circling wing and how to relate it to other elements of the American Kenpo system. So keep in mind that this is not a full comprehensive list and it is not family groupings. The better way to think about it is just different avenues that we're going to explore to uncover some very interesting ways to think about how to relate this technique to other techniques. So along that vein, we're going to stick with the idea of variations on grabbing. Okay? So before we do that, we should probably define what a grab is. Well, from a layman's perspective, what is a grab? It's basically trying to control something with your hand through squeezing it. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit more. What it actually is happening here. Well, what we're doing is we're doing a vice-like maneuver. So in other words, we're affecting more than one side of that weapon that we're trying to control or environmental object we're trying to control. And the reason why we do the squeeze is to generate friction so that we can continue that control by creating the friction so it doesn't slide in our hand. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk through one more thing that you should keep in mind here while you're watching this video, is that there's different perspectives going on here. You guys are the third person perspective, but then we have the first and second person. Me as the defender and what I'm doing to counteract what they're doing through grabbing, and then what they're doing to us through grabbing. In other words, how they're attacking us through grabbing. So if you'll notice, almost every single one of these techniques are done through some variation on grabbing against me from a second person's perspective. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. So along those lines, let's start out with a standard type of grab. The person reaches out and they grab us. You would say to yourself, are they truly grabbing us? Well, technically, no, they're not grabbing us. They're grabbing an environmental object, which happens to be on us, in this case, our clothing. Okay? Get that out of the way. Let's talk through what we're doing to them. What we're going to do is we're going to counter grab them. So in other words, we keep that pinned to us as we continue in with our technique, and that brings in something like the lone kimono. There's the twin kimono version of this, or the double-handed version of this. So what changes here? So, well, I only have one hand I'm going to use here because I want to keep this hand free. So what do? I do the lone kimono version, but then I need more to control the second hand. So what I use is different parts of my body to pin. So yes, we have a true grab against them, but then we have a variation on the grabbing, which in this case is the pinning with our forearm. And again, that's twin kimono. So let's kick this up a notch a little bit about grabbing us. So something like a clutching feathers, where they actually reach out and they grab our hair. Are they really grabbing us? Again, technically, yes, they are grabbing us, but they're not really. Because if you think about your hair, it is part of you, but it isn't really. So it's a step up from just grabbing an environmental object. But just like we did in lone kimono, we can treat it the same way and just use a single hand. So now let's talk about truly grabbing us, something like a glancing spear, where they're actually grabbing our wrist. But let's start varying how we're going to be dealing with their grab. Rather than counter grabbing, we're going to counter grab in a different way. So the way we're going to do this is with the back of our hand. So if you'll notice, I'm doing that vice-like maneuvering again, and then I'm starting to use that friction in order to control the weapon, but I'm doing it with the back of my hands. And of course, there's a double version of this, which is Desperate Falcons, where I'm doing the exact same thing. And I'll close my hands just to prove it, to where I can control this with the backs of my hands. Okay? That gives us a variation on that double grab. Okay, so we do it with the back of our hands. Can we do it with the front of our hands? That would bring in something like a defensive cross, where we're actually going against the leg using the front of our hands. We can also do the uncrossed version of this, and that would bring in something like a blinding sacrifice, where we're actually starting to use the front of our hands. And this brings in a reason of why we might want to do that. That would be because we can't really just grab their head with our hand. It's too big. So we have to start using different parts of our body instead to do this grab. Okay, so speaking of that, let's take it back to our original technique here, circling wing, and talking about grabbing using different parts of our body. In this case, not even our arms to start out with. They're grabbing us to choke us, but what do? We want to pull them with us as we begin to walk. So how do we do that? So in this case, we do it through our head and neck and the shoulders. So as we begin to step forward, we can pull them with us, which is a variation of that grabbing theme again. So now we do it a different way. So the way we're going to do it this way is we're going to use our tricep here against our body to pin and pull, again, creating that vice-like maneuvering and the friction so that we can do our backup weapons. So let's do this from a variation on that. Locked wing. So if we get into locked wing, we break them down, which you could theoretically consider that a variation on locking in an offset manner. But then what we weren't really paying attention to is this form of grabbing with the arm, not the hand. And again, I'm going to close my hand so you can see it. So I'm going to be using the forearm and the front of my tricep, in this case the bicep, rather than the tricep itself. So we've done a single version of that. Let's do a double version of this. This would bring in something like a repeated devastation. But just like we did previously, we have two hands here in twin kimono, but they're from behind us. So we can treat it very similar to the way we did in twin kimono. We actually come in here and do what we did in the locked wing to pin it, and then we do the grab, very similar to what I did in twin kimono. Okay? So then we can say we have a horizontal version of this, something like a crashing wings. We're actually going to be doing the double and then scraping them off and pinning them to the sides here. So we've done a vertical version, double, single, and now we're doing a horizontal version of it. What about pinning the hands? So in this case, we could do something very similar to that we did in twin kimono and long kimono by just pinning, and now due to the position of our hands, we can get both hands with one of our hands. But then we have a true grab again. This is squeezing the peach, where we actually grab to different parts of our body in order to control that opponent. Okay, now one other thing we have to think about here before we close this out is whatever we can do with our hands, we can do with our feet. So let's bring this back to something like a scraping hoof. We do the same thing we did in repeated devastation without the grabbing piece. Instead, we're going to the low end. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually do this stomp. So if you think about it, stretching that definition of what a grab is we're doing it in an offensive manner. We're still doing device-like maneuvering, and we are still getting that friction. So you could theoretically say, by stretching that definition, that we are actually grabbing their foot. But let's get this back in a little bit more into a true grab. So if we continue on to the extension with the same technique, what are we doing here? We're actually grabbing with the foot and then using the shin in order to affect our opponent in the way we want. So in other words, to control that weapon. So in summary, what did we do? We related circling wing to other elements of the American Kenpo system through variations on grabbing. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.